Thank you all for coming so numerous. We have many fantastic speakers and not a lot of time, so the moderators will be very strict when it comes to the timing, and we still want to have a bit of a discussion with all of you. Nonetheless, there will be 3 panels following the opening remarks from the European Data Protection Supervisor, and then closing remarks. Then for those who would like to continue, there is an informal part of it also at 5 p.m. in London Calling. What else? The event is being streamed online on the European Parliament website. It's going to be recorded. There is also journalists in the room, for what I'm also grateful, but that's also for you to know that the event is subject to certain public interest. For the online speakers, we kindly ask them to to turn off their camera after they finish speaking, because if they don't, then their face will be projected on a big screen for half an hour, which they might not want to have. Okay, that's it. Wojciech, let's start.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for devoting the lunchtime to the discussion on this uneasy problems, uneasy topics. I must admit that your response to the EDPS call for one more reflection has exceeded our hopes and ambitions. I take it as a sign of your commitment to a very important issue we are going to discuss today. Let me first explain why we are here and why EDPS is organizing this short discussion. European Data Protection Supervisor is an advisor of the EU legislator, a role which we exercise through issuing opinions and formal comments, but also through the informal and day-to-day cooperation with the parliamentarians and also the representatives of the Commission and the Council. We are at the disposal of the lawmakers throughout the legislative process, acknowledging the discretion they have. Why does EDPS need to organize an event in the premises of the Parliament when both here and in the Council works are ongoing to finalize the negotiations? The so-called CSAM proposal is, in our view, the regulation whose consequences might go well beyond what concerns the protection of children. It is often being used in the debate that this proposal is only about protecting children. I would like this to be the case, but it's not only about children, it's not only about protecting. I'm worried that what it might bring goes beyond the remit of the ever so complex and delicate discussion about what privacy means in the democratic society. I'm concerned that it questions the foundations which, once undermined, lead to the radical shift from which there might be no return. That's why I used this expression that this is point of no return in one of the interviews. The risk that children are exposed to the horrible threats they might face, both online and offline, are something we should be determined to minimize. These issues are of incredible importance. For me, the father of 2 daughters who are 16 and 9, this is the front line. These issues are sensitive and they are complex. A democratic debate on such problems and means to counter them should therefore be done with deep respect to these 2 notions, sensitivity and complexity. Sensitivity required caution in terms of language use, organizing the debate, inclusiveness, respect to different views. Complexity requires respect to evidence, to data, to expertise, to due the legislative process. I would like to ask all of us to have a respect to all the participants of the discussion, even if we don't agree with them, even if we do not share their point of view, they all have a goodwill. They all want to do the good things for the society. But this is complex and this is sensitive matter. And it is with those characteristics in mind that we would like to approach today the seminar. I look forward for the discussion today. I encourage you, speakers and participants, to share your knowledge. The floor will be all yours, despite the very limited time we have. We will not have today with us the European Commission, but I would like to stress that I have invited Commissioner Johansson to our seminar. I hope that despite her absence, the collective wisdom of the seminar will be heard among the EU institutions and beyond. As you know, the event is streamed. We also have several journalists with us. Thank you for coming. So everything we share today will be in public domain. With this, let me thank you all once more for being here, and thank the people from the EDPS office for organizing that. Thanks our friends from the Parliament for helping us to find the nice place for this discussion. And I pass the floor to Kazik to start the first panel.
So the objective of the first round is to set the scene by presenting the main areas of concern regarding the proposal. As we hear, the proposal aims at preventing and combating child sexual abuse online and offline by detecting the proliferation of CSAM material and grooming. However, many stakeholders question the effectiveness, necessity, and proportionality of the proposed regulation. So I'd like to invite in this round key stakeholders to discuss the main issues at stake and why the CSAM proposal has, in spite of its commendable objectives, raised substantial criticism. I will first turn to Arda Gerkens, chair of the Dutch National Authority for the Prevention of Online Terrorist Content and Child Sexual Abuse Material, and ask you what is, in your view, needed for an effective fight against CSAM, and what, in that context, is your assessment as to whether the proposed measure will work in practice. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me on this very important panel. It's indeed a very good question. The regulation says it's there to combat the spreading of online child sexual abuse material. But unfortunately, the definition of CSAM, as it's called, does not really reflect what the material in fact is. Because, however illegal, a big part of the material that we see is not a result of sexual abuse. The material is indeed being spread via the internet, but it's a growing number which is a result of sexual activity of young people amongst themselves. The classical form of child sexual abuse material is often found on image hosting websites, which are being used to spread the material via the dark web. This material consists of images of children being physically abused, leaked images of voluntarily sexting, extortion or sextortion, but also children who voluntarily performed sexual acts in live streams, not knowing that they were at that point already videotaped. Although this is definitely an appalling abuse of the trust and also morally despicable, it's not a form of sexual abuse as such. Many times these children don't even know that their images are spread online. The physical abuse is about 90% of the cases being done by somebody in the environment of the child. So leaked images and sextortion are quite often a result of even hacked accounts. Even more reason why we should keep the internet safe and secure. And mind you, a child can be extorted with more than just a nude, because more images can already be embarrassing to them. So the scanning of private communication will certainly flag problematic situations. I definitely know that that's already happening, but it's not the solution to combat this sexual child abuse. Scanning for no material can, however, play a role, I think, in cleaning up the internet. It's what we already do in the Netherlands. For instance, image hosting websites that make use of a hash checking tool to identify no material and then stop the further spreading, but not to prosecute. This is an important element in combating online abuse, but the legislation doesn't really properly address these websites, as it's too much focus of the private communication and subsequently prosecution. So to detect perpetrators and end domestic sexual violence, this legislation is most likely going to be counterproductive. The sheer amount of images will overflow the systems we have and put even more pressure on the fragile law enforcement systems. It would be much better to invest in those systems and strengthen collaborations between the EU countries. Last but not least, we should involve the children. We are speaking here about them. We are judging about what they do online. We have a moral opinion about it, but we're not talking to them. They are the ones we are speaking about. We haven't involved them in this legislation. I think we should. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Professor Susan Landau. We are very grateful for her participation, joining us from across the Atlantic. Professor Landau, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
The floor is yours. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. I would like to follow up with discussing the different types of child sexual abuse and exploitation that occur over the network, because I think that's an important aspect of this problem. There are actually four. There's the sharing, there's the display of images, there's the perceived person that was just described, in which a child has a photo done of them and then, or a video, and sharing it with someone they choose to share it with, but then it gets spread further. There's internet-enabled sex trafficking, and there's live streaming of sexual abuse, in which a customer tells the abuser what to do to the child. And they're very different crimes with very different forms of prevention and investigation. Facebook did a study a couple of years ago and discovered that the sharing of images is in a small study, it was only 150 people, 3/4 of them were sharing it because they found the images humorous, which is somewhat hard to believe, or because they were angry about the images. The point about that group of people is that they can be told the costs of sharing such images, the high chance of that it is a crime with a serious consequence, and simplifying reporting is a good way to stop that kind of sharing. The perceived first person, in which the child is sharing an image, that's a case where the child is a victim, but the child is not part of the criminal activity. And it's exactly educating the child, making it easy for the child to report, telling the child that the child doesn't have consequences if they report. With internet-enabled sex trafficking, 88% of the victims do not want to report the abuser because the abuser is a family member or a family friend. With that, investigating can only go so far because you cannot actually prosecute in many cases. So what you need there, as well as with real-time abuse, is spaces that make children safe, community spaces, online safety education, education about online security and safety by design. All of this is discussed quite extensively in a report by Laura Draper of American University, and I would urge the Commission to use that as a basis for examining how to look at that problem. The point is that the law requires scanning to handle the child's sexual abuse and exploitation issue, misunderstands the issue. There are multiple ways, as I've just explained very briefly, to prevent and investigate the crime that are not affected by end-to-end encryption. Meanwhile, end-to-end encryption is a technology that secures both children and adults. There are children, LGBTQ children, who do use the internet as a way to explore their sexuality. Often these children are in situations at home where they cannot say what's happening, who they are, and what they're thinking about. And so having the security and safety of encrypted communications is important. It's also critically important for all of society. It protects our personal security, our business security, our national security. It's why you see national security leaders in both the United States and in England, people who have retired from the national security community, but have been in the positions of the head of the NSA, the head of GCHQ, supporting end-to-end encryption. And it's for that reasons that we really need a law. We do not need a law that prevents the use of end-to-end encryption. I have colleagues later who will speak about the problems of scanning, including its inability to do things correctly, but I will stop here and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. This was, both interventions were already so rich in substance. And in the context of what we heard and more broadly, turning to you, Ms. Sippel, what's your kind of assessment on the impact of the current framework and the currently discussed framework regarding the confidentiality of communication?
Thank you very much. And I made a lot of notices, but I will try to shorten them a little bit. I think we just heard that this proposal was foreseen to prevent child sexual abuse and also prevent or fight back the dissemination of material. But if we look into the proposal as presented by the Commission, it's very much focusing on the second point. So finding the material, so acting after the crime already has been taken place. And we cannot hardly find anything on the preventive side, which is nevertheless very important. So we tend to say again and again that our union is a union of values and fundamental rights are very much important to us. But it's not enough to state in a legislative file that, oh yes, fundamental rights do exist, and yes, we have the Charter, full stop, but then not precisely describe what it means in a concrete legislation. But that's important, and we don't see it in this piece of legislation. So the mandatory scanning of all kinds of communication of everybody under all circumstances, this is more or less a question of mass surveillance. And there is no longer any kind of privacy. And I think it will have effects not only on adults, but especially on young people who need, first of all, trying to find out who they are. Also, they use the internet and all the different things that we find there to find out their sexual identity. So if they cannot be sure that can be done without being surveyed all the time by whomever, they will look for something else and they will destroy their possibility to do so. So I fully agree that with the very, very serious crimes we see, we also have to take into consideration that child sexual abuse and exploitation can take place in very different forms. And I think some of our speakers already talked about it. And I think many adults are thinking about the most difficult pictures, unacceptable pictures you can imagine when they talk about the file. But already a nude picture of a young boy or girl at a beach, at home, can be a result of child sexual abuse, but can also be just a picture done, shared with a friend, and both have accepted to it. So how will you find out? So the question is, what are the definitions? What will any kind of system look into it? And how can we avoid that a number of people, both regarding pictures, but also regarding communication, meaning text, will be falsely under suspicion? And what effects will that have on people, especially young people, if they may, in the context of investigation, being contacted? Hey, we believe you have been a victim. What consequences will that have? And also, of course, it will have an impact on our law enforcement authorities who have to find out, is this really a case or is it not? But coming back to fundamental rights, once again, I think it's good that we had the GDPR. It's good that we have e-privacy directive, even though it's not really implemented totally all over European Union. And to be honest, I feel a little bit harassed that the willingness of member states to talk about e-privacy regulation, meaning that the same level of protection that we have foreseen for telecommunication will be there also for other digital forms of communication, there is not much will. There are no negotiations really effectively taken place. So at the same time, while we are not talking about protecting privacy, meaning a fundamental right, which is also linked to the fundamental right of privacy, freedom of expression, and many other things. So we are not even talking about that together with the Council, but we are not only restricting fundamental rights in a legislative proposal like this, we totally ignore it. We totally ignore the right to privacy, to data protection, to a fundamental right that is not only enshrined in our charter, in the treaties, but where years ago we started to have some legislative points. So I think that's the things that we have to talk about. And I also would like to say that it takes some time to find the right balance in this proposal, both in the Parliament, also in the council, maybe even though for different reasons in the two institutions. But I think it's worth to take the time to find a better balance between protecting fundamental rights for everyone, adults and also children, and also find a way to be more targeted, trying to find the offenders, at the same time strengthening not only young people themselves, but their parents and everybody working with children, so that they are all aware what's going on, what can happen in the internet, and also to strengthen users to report back whenever they are aware that something is going wrong. So from the Parliament side, I think it's very important to ensure this. It should be the same importance in the Council and in the Commission. And I only can hope that all the two institutions in the end will find a compromise and a good solution to really find a solution for the 2 points, fight back this unacceptable crime to the biggest extent possible, but also to protect fundamental rights, also to the biggest extent possible. Otherwise, I think this will have a damage on a very fundamental basis to our societies and our view as European Union to be the very place where fundamental rights and values are protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Ella, you would like to build on that. Edric has been quite vocal on this proposal, so I wonder what would you like to add now?
I'd like to start by reminding of something that the UN Special Rapporteur on Privacy has stated. Privacy enables the enjoyment of other rights, the free development and expression of an individual's personality, identity, and beliefs, and their ability to participate in political, economic, social, and cultural life. In other words, privacy is not a nice to have, but an essential gateway to all of our other fundamental rights. Yet, since the inception of this proposal, the European Commission has asked us in no uncertain terms to choose between privacy and safety. This disingenuous narrative has been reiterated in surveys which have crassly asked people if they agree that the ability to detect child abuse is more important than the right to online privacy. This is a misrepresentation of both privacy and safety, as if we can all altruistically give up some of our privacy in order to keep children safe online. It doesn't work in that way. And this sort of attitude really fails to grasp the deep social roots of the crime that we are talking about. To the contrary, I think it's clear that privacy and safety are mutually reinforcing. And so I want to highlight two critiques that don't often get much airtime in this debate, but that I think really show how that is the case in practical terms. The first is professional secrecy, and many organizations representing journalists and lawyers have raised deep concerns about the Commission's proposal. For example, the Council of Bars and Law Societies of Europe, which comprises 46 legal associations, warns that the proposal would undermine professional secrecy and legal professional privilege. And they state that the consequences of breaching those privileges could include the denial of legal advice, the obstruction of access to justice and the right to a fair trial, and the violation of trust between lawyers and their clients as guaranteed by the European Convention. This, of course, on the surface should be of concern to all of us in a democratic society. But even more so when we're thinking about this crime of child sexual abuse, where securing convictions of perpetrators is so deeply important, the idea that this law could stand in the way of already fragile access to justice for survivors should not be taken lightly, but this element was not even considered in the Commission's proposal. Another dimension that has really lacked awareness is the impact on young people that are involved in democracy and activism, who around the world are increasingly suppressed and even criminalized. Despite child rights law requiring their voices to be listened to in laws that will impact young people, we've heard very little from children and young people themselves. In fact, in a representative survey that was undertaken earlier this year, it was found that 80% of young people aged between 13 and 17 from across 13 EU member states would not feel comfortably being politically active or exploring their sexuality if authorities were able to monitor their digital communication. And that was specifically asked if it was being done for the purpose of scanning for child sexual abuse. So it's really clear when we ask young people if this is the sort of measure that they want to keep them safe, that this is not the answer. To quote Aura, a young activist from Germany, young people need encryption to feel empowered. And instead, what we're giving them is a disempowering proposal that hasn't even considered all of the ways that young people benefit from privacy and security online for access to all of their digital rights. I'd need the rest of this event and probably more to tell you about all the other criticisms and concerns that have been raised, whether from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, several survivors associations, and many more. So instead, I'll just reiterate that the EU's uniqueness must be in finding measures to keep children safe in line with the fundamental rights and data protection frameworks of which we are rightly very proud. Otherwise, we are failing children too.
Thank you. There's so much in each of your interventions, and I think we should have a 1 minute break after everybody to let that sink in. But we don't have that luxury. But I think after this 20 minutes, we already have a very clear kind of mapping of where the issues are on the level of principles, but also, in more details as well. But there's one thing that that so far was not mentioned, and we wanted to put it on the agenda of that panel, namely the role of, or interplay with the law enforcement context, and in particular the role of Europol. So we would like to ask Saskia Wickman for her take on this.
Thank you very much, and thank you for also organizing this seminar. Indeed, I've been working on the reform of Europol's mandates and asking the question of the relevance of the links, cooperation between EU Center and Europol naturally should bring us to say yes, to say it is a natural partner for the fight against child sexual abuse. But at the same time, knowing the agenda that the agency has been pursuing those last years on accessing massive data also for other purposes, I have to say that my feelings are quite mixed. On the cooperation with EU agencies, I think we should also push for a multidisciplinary approach and not only a law enforcement approach. Let only take the example of a closer cooperation with organizations supporting victims, for instance. On the data part, you know that the objective of Europol is to become a data hub and to also enlarge and strengthen its missions. And we know at the same time that this can lead us to something like a black box. And let only take the latest investigation led by the EDPS on the fact that data of minors aged below 15 have been used by the agency outside its mandate. And so to answer the question, is there a risk of function creep? I think there is, obviously, not only because of what has happened before in the evolution of the legislation around Europol, but also because it seems that Europol has been pushing to obtain in this legislation what it aims for, namely collect data, extend access to data and unfiltered data, and which is also reflected in the Commission's proposal. If I read it, all reports not manifestly unfounded will have to be sent simultaneously to Europol and national law enforcement agencies. So far, the European Parliament's position is not going into that direction. Thank you to the negotiators or shadow rapporteurs. But nevertheless, the initial proposal of the Commission is going in that direction. And last but not least, investigation of Balkan Insights has shown end of September that Europol has been also pushing for extended detection to other crime areas beyond CSAM. And this came without surprise to me, because this is the agenda also of the Law Investigation Agency, is to collect data. And what I find really problematic is the instrumentalization of such a sensitive topic, emotional question also related to the fight and legitimate fight and prior fight against child sexual abuse. And this is also what we as MEPs, as European Parliament, have to dig into. And we will have the exchanges with the Commissioner in our LIBE committee, because we want to know more about this and other revelations of Balkan insights when it comes to potential conflicts of interests. And let us regret the absence of the Commission, because I think we need dialogue. I think we need to share knowledge and information in this file, and that the fact that there's a closed door brings us to more suspicion also. If we want to believe that the intentions are positive and to fight against child sexual abuse, then it means that every party, every person needs to be also open to the counter arguments and bring founded arguments to explain why they want to go into that direction. So the question is the Commission misled, misinformed? What is it? And this is also true for the Council side, because we know that in the discussions we can have with the national responsible people, there's probably also a lack of understanding of what is discussed today and the risks related to the end of end-to-end encryption.
Thank you very much. We have now reached, I think, the end of the panel. We have not with us, sadly, Meredith Whitaker from Signal, who couldn't make it due to personal reasons. And that makes me feel like we slightly maybe missed the voice of industry in terms of what, the implications of the objectives of the proposal might be for the industry. But I'm allowed myself to ask Helen Charles, who is supposed to speak on the panel 3, to maybe quickly give her views on that, and maybe this would also trigger a short discussion right after that.
Thank you very much. So as a provider of end-to-end encrypted messaging, I think we would support the aims of the regulation, but we, as colleagues have raised, we have several concerns with the proposed implementation. And these are particularly around the detection orders and the focus on detection only in the regulation. We think that any outcome that requires scanning of content in end-to-end encrypted messaging would undermine fundamental rights, as several colleagues have set out. And instead, the draft regulation should set the right conditions for services like WhatsApp and other end-to-end encrypted services to mitigate the misuse of our services in a way that's reasonable and proportionate, but that also considers both the different nature of harm, as Susan Landau outlined in her intervention, but also includes things like prevention and other upstream measures that could help tackle these kinds of harms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 8-10 minutes for questions, comments, views, after which we'll have a short recess and next panel. So if there's any questions, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and speak. It's time to speak now. There's not much time left. There's surprising lack of interest in speaking compared to the number of speakers in this seminar. If that's the case, then I would like maybe to ask the speakers if there's, they would like to comment on on something that they have heard? One more statement? Sorry? Alexander, please go ahead.
I want to take us back 20 years. 20 years ago, in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11, there was a move by member states and other countries around the world to introduce these millimeter wave scanners in airports. You're probably all aware of them. One of my first privacy campaigns was actually fighting the mandatory use of the millimeter wave scanners in the airports, and a law was passed in the EU to make this voluntary. So now, as a result of that, we can all go through the airports and we can decline going through these scanners. And the reason why there was a kickback against this was because the scanners produce fairly low resolution, but still images of our individual bodies when they're naked. And it was determined that this was a breach of our dignity and a breach of our fundamental right to privacy. And as such, European rules were that we would not go down that road. One of the problems we see with, and this has been discussed by several of my colleague speakers, is the fact that much of the imagery which is being circulated online is actually young people expressing themselves sexually to other young people in a consenting manner. And one of the things which I haven't seen discussed by the Commission at all in any of their material over the past 4 years, because keep in mind we had a derogation prior to this proposal, is the impact of that on those individuals, those consenting children or consenting young adults experiencing or experimenting in their sexual identity. And this is the fact that if we now introduce a law which requires the scanning of all digital communications, and by that we're talking billions, tens of billions of communications every single day across the EU, those images would then be sent to multiple individuals along the chain of investigation, including Europol and various law enforcement bodies, etc., creating victims. Because one of the things that we see, and speaking as a survivor myself, one of the things that we see in relation to CSAM is the impact on the dignity of the individuals to whom it relates. And the very fact that people are viewing these images, which is exactly the intent of the Commission to try and overcome, is a form of abuse itself. So if we now take innocent pictures which are being shared among consenting individuals and expose them to potentially hundreds of other individuals down the investigation chain, then we are indeed actually creating more victims as a result of this. So this is something which I think we need to consider. If we don't accept that our bodies can be scanned and produce rudimentary 3D images in a scanner in the airport, and keep in mind at the time we were told by all the lobbyists for this technology that if we didn't introduce this as a mandatory measure, then the skies would rain with terror. And I would like to add that that actually hasn't been the case. I'm not aware of any incidents where we've had hijacked flights over the EU since the scanners were implemented, and the voluntary use of them was made law. So if we're in that situation there, how can we now condone as parents of children and as politicians and as legislators that we would allow very high resolution, very accurate imagery of our children to be seen by multiple other parties, which is completely consensual from the perspective of the children who are sending these images to each other, to combat this problem which the European Commission are trying to combat? I don't think it's appropriate to create more victims off the back of a piece of legislation which is supposed to try and help victims. So that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you. Arda, would you like to add something?
Yes, I'd like to add something because the picture itself doesn't say anything. You have to look in the context, meaning you have to look in the whole conversation to see whether there was some form of extortion or voluntary sharing. So it's much more than just the image. It's the whole context around it. And if I'm, when I was young and I'm looking at my kids as well, my children don't even want me to look into a conversation, let alone somebody who is a stranger. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Andrea?
Yes, thank you. Andrea from European Digital Rights. I have one question in relation to some of the statements that were already made. So we've heard that the scanning proposed under the CSAR would disproportionately affect young people because of the reality of exchanging messages. And whoever has young kids or friends knows that that's a fact. We also heard that 80% of young people would feel uncomfortable to express themselves politically if they would know their messages would would be scanned. And we also know that, at least publicly, the EU does want to have young people more politically active. So how do we try to mitigate this really double standard? In the past, we spoke to a group of a camp organizing political sessions for people coming from a Roma community. And when they heard about this proposed measure, they said, our young people already have a lot of distrust towards the state. Coming from a community that the state has historically oppressed, we're trying to get these people to be politically active. Knowing that their messages will be scanned will never, never make them feel comfortable. So to me, it's also a question of what is the effect on those young people that we're lacking from a democratic debate, that don't have trust in the state, that come from communities historically oppressed, that this kind of solutions would completely shut them down from political dialogue.
Thank you, Andrea. I was wondering maybe if Mrs. Sippel, the question is about political involvement as well. What's your take on that?
I remember a citation, I think it came from Zuckerberg, saying there is no privacy any longer because he was promoting his ideas. But I think young people, even though they spread a lot of communications in this digital environments, they have a clear sense for privacy. And they don't want everything to be seen and read by everyone. This might come by a surprise if you see what they are doing on the internet, but they have a sense. And I'm afraid that maybe when doing this legislation, the Commission was not really aware that young people, if I may express it that way, do live in this digital world. So they no longer do experiences and try to find out their identity while talking physically to friends or other people. They do it online and they exchange pictures. They even try to find out how can I express myself in words. So as I said in the beginning, if everything is surveyed at any time, this will have an influence, generally speaking, to our open society. It will have an influence on freedom of expression. People will be careful to be outspoken on some of their positions, whether they believe, many people think that, or whether they believe, oh, this might be a critical idea, they might no longer express it. But how can we find out what's going on in our society and handle it if we are no longer aware? So this is a really fundamental point. And I think coming back to something, if I may add this sentence, what my colleague Saskia Bricmont said, it's true that for long, Commission, Council tried to find a way to increase the data they are allowed to collect. There is an aim since long. They tried it with terrorism. Oh, now we have to collect everything. And now they tried with CSAM. And the fact that Europol already is stating that, of course, once the system is there, they will use it. The other side of it is when the Commission is saying, oh, but providers are already doing it nevertheless. So where's the problem? The problem is that we as legislators, if private companies are surveying everybody at any time, we should find ways to restrict that instead of legalizing it. Because when we legalize it or even ask them to do that, not only private companies will do that, but also law enforcement, others will do that. And as I said, this will have a fundamental impact on all of our societies, the way we communicate, the way we have open discussions. As Mr. Wiewiorowski said at the beginning, we need to have an open debate whether we like the position or not, but we have to talk about it. This will no longer take place in an online world where everybody knows that everything is surveyed.
Thank you. I think this serves as a very powerful conclusion and a summary of a panel. So I'd like to pass the floor to Brendan. It's also a moment to quickly get a cup of coffee for those who want, and we can move slowly to the second panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If people could please take their places to continue this discussion. It's clear that everybody has a lot to say to each other, and I think it will be very enriching if we can continue in the same trend as the first panel, which touched on many very pertinent issues. And the aim of this round is actually to dig deeper on a number of specific issues raised by the CSAM proposal, and in particular as regards to the so-called detection orders, which several speakers have already alluded to in the previous round. Now, so our main underlying question is, how likely is the proposal going to succeed in achieving its goals? Because proponents argue that the detection orders would be an effective means of combating the dissemination of child sexual abuse material online. It's also claimed that several technologies exist to reliably detect the dissemination with only limited adverse impact on bona fide users of interpersonal communications, and that there would be no disincentive for the use of any given technology, including end-to-end encryption. So what we would like to do in this round is to give external experts the opportunity to offer their insights, in particular as regards to the effectiveness, accuracy, and legality of the detection orders foreseen by the proposal. I'm going to ask speakers to be succinct in their interventions, 2 to 3 minutes maximum, so as to allow for sufficient time for discussion afterwards. So I'd like to turn again to Alexander Hamp, who we have heard from already during the discussion before, who is a data privacy expert with a background in computer science, sociology, psychology, and law, and as he has also mentioned, a survivor of child sexual abuse himself. And so my question to you is, when it comes to the detection of child sexual abuse material and the use of detection orders, what impact should we expect such measures to have? How effective will they be?
I mean, the first thing we need to understand about the detection orders is we've heard a lot of rhetoric around end-to-end encryption and denials from various stakeholders at the Commission that end-to-end encryption would necessarily be impacted by the detection orders. But as we've seen from a number of scholarly articles which have been written on this issue, it would be impossible to be able to achieve the intent of the detection orders without interfering with end-to-end encryption. Okay, it's not possible to be able to detect the dissemination of these images and also the grooming content, etc., which are also included in this much broader proposal compared to the derogation, without interfering with end-to-end encryption, because most of the services that we use in the modern world on digital platforms are end-to-end encrypted nowadays, and for good reason. End-to-end encryption is seen as something which is incredibly important for digital communications, for confidentiality. It's the core of the business sector, particularly around e-commerce, banking, and trade. It's also incredibly important for our communications, as was mentioned by Ella, in relation to confidentiality for professional services, etc. So, to undermine end-to-end encryption, and there's a number of cartoons going around online around this issue at the moment, we're not talking about just the good guys would have access to this. We would see this being used by other regimes that may not be necessarily so democratic or so regardful of fundamental human rights. We've also seen mission creep already through leaked memos from Europol, as was just discussed in the previous session, about how they can use this for other purposes, not just for the detection of CSAM. So it's end-to-end encryption is incredibly important, as I said. But also we need to consider what the circumvention possibilities are here. And keep in mind that most of the research we've seen over the past 4 years in response to first the derogation and now this proposal has shown very clearly that a lot of the content which is being disseminated online is consensual, is not actually as a result of of abuse, and in many cases is also just people resharing. I know that we have Thomas here in the audience from Facebook, that Facebook have done a number of research topics on this, where they've looked at the resharing of the same images, showing that actually a large percentage of the images which have been detected are the same image, either reshared and slightly modified in a way that it makes it look like a new image and adds to those numbers. And these issues have not been taken into account by the Commission in their proposal and in the dialogue that they've had, or limited dialogue they've had since introducing the proposal. So this is a problem as well. And in my thesis, which I just completed this summer, I looked at various other circumvention techniques, such as the use of private networks, the use of the onion routing network known as Tor or the dark web, the use of VPNs and other private networks that people can set up in order to circumvent this. Use of things like steganography to hide images within other images, to hide illegal content within lawful content. But there's also, we need to consider this is looking at AI as a solution for most of these. In fact, the current models are using AI. And there are also attacks against the AI. So we don't just see an issue with regards to false positives. We also see attacks which can lead to false negatives, where images which are CSAM material would not be detected because of adversarial attacks against the AI. I'm not going to get technical because this isn't the audience for that, but this is something which has been studied. There have been a number of academic papers released on this already, so I'd recommend that people research that if they wish to do so. But this technology is not free from error. And we're talking many billions of communications every day. So even if we have a 0.1% error rate, that accounts for many millions of false positives or false negatives on a daily basis, which is not something that we can subscribe to in a democracy. So there are huge risks with regards to these detection orders and the effectiveness of them, and whether or not it would actually be easy to circumvent, which it would, and whether or not they would be effective in the purpose that they're being used for. So that's my thoughts on the detection orders at this point.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to turn to the next speaker to develop these points a little bit further from their perspective. So the question that always comes up is, are these technologies which are intended to detect CSAM dissemination really as accurate and reliable to be? And for example, the Commission's impact assessment indicates that photodNA's rate of false positives is estimated at no more than 1 in 50 billion based on testing. But the question is whether these technologies are effectively tamper-proof and how difficult it might be to either avoid detection, and I think Alex talked already on some of those points, or to generate a false positive. I'd like to turn to Professor Jaap Henk Hoopman, who is joining us online. I hope he is ready to take the floor.
Yep.
Please, the floor is yours, Jaap Henk. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and sorry for not being there. Usually Brussels is but a train ride away, but I'm in Karlstad, Sweden, so I'm joining online. And the question of how easy or difficult it will be to for perpetrators to avoid detection or for someone to generate a false positive is really a significant one. And as Alexander already mentioned, it's important, and already discussed this a little bit, it's important to distinguish basically the three different tiers of detection that the proposal proposes. There's the detection of known CSAM, there's the detection of unknown CSAM, and there's the detection of trying to detect grooming. I will let's focus on this detection of unknown CSAM using AI techniques. To be blunt, I think these have horrible statistics. There's either going to be a very high false positive rate or a very high false negative rate, and it's going to be simply impossible to bring these down to anything reasonable. And as already mentioned in the previous session, that would mean that children experimenting and discovering their own sexuality would, because of these false positives, become victims of these kind of classifying detection algorithms. So it should be clear that these kind of like detection mechanisms for unknown CSAM are simply not effective nor proportional. And I've been following the discussion of this dossier, and the latest proposal by the Commission seems to be somewhat aware of this, at least by temporarily or sort of like putting the detection of unknown CSAM not straight into the current version of the proposal. So let us focus on the more narrow detection of known CSAM, which is based on the database of known fingerprints. First, the question of false negatives. That is, how easy is it to avoid detection? The problem here is that the techniques being discussed here, either photodNA or neural hash, are proprietary and therefore not publicly available and known and studyable algorithms, which means that we simply have to rely on the figures provided by the companies on how effective these technologies are. However, there have been academics and others, hackers, that have reverse engineered, for example, photo DNA. And this has revealed that it's particularly easy to evade detection against a known fingerprint of known CSAM by simply rotating or mirroring the image. And clearly this has implications for the proportionality of the proposal, because a serious breach of privacy is being proposed for a not so effective measure. And then the other question of the false positives for known CSAM is being claimed to be 1 in 10 billion for photo DNA. So if it's an accidental false positive, I would argue that this is not really a serious problem in practice. So that would not stand in the way of the proposal. However, and I think Alexander was already referring to that as well in his intervention, there are several papers that have shown that targeted efforts to generate false positives are definitely possible, meaning that you can create a collision between one image and another image, meaning that, for example, a innocent looking image would, by somewhat tuning some of the aspects of the image without being noticeable to the person looking at the image, which would mean that then it is detected as an image matching a fingerprint of non-CSAM in the database, is certainly possible. And that would mean that either things like framing people, tricking people to forward innocuously looking images and then getting them detected and then being put under investigation, or other approaches like trying to modify an innocent image to match the fingerprint of a CSAM in a database. And thus, this could be used by activists to DDoS the system and actually flooding the detection pipeline with innocuous images that are first flagged as being CSAM and then later will be detected that they're not. So these are serious issues with even the detection of known CSAM that I think the Commission has not been taken enough care of. So that's my intervention for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penk. And I would like to turn to Professor Bart Pradeel, who is the head of the Computer Security and Industrial Cryptography Department at KU Leuven, to discuss a little bit, in addition to the new CSAM, also about the technologies to detect grooming and whether he would consider these techniques as reliable or whether we are in fact in the risk of legislating on the promise of a technology that does not yet exist. Bart, the floor is yours.
Brendan, thank you for having me. I apologize I can't be there in person, but I'm so committed to this initiative that actually I attend late nights from down under, and I try to complement some of the points the previous speakers made on the technical point. So I think maybe it's first important to emphasize that with state of the art, there have been studies and reports suggesting that you could do some of this detection on encrypted content, but it's very clear that not today and not in a decade, and probably not in several decades to come, we can do detection, especially not of new content or grooming, on encrypted content, which means we have to do client-side scanning, we have to do detection on the device of the user, and that has specific implications I will come back to. So second point is for grooming, maybe let's make sure that everybody is clear what it means. So grooming is defined as an adult seeking to meet a minor for the purpose of engaging in sexual activities with a child or for the production of child pornography. So again, companies have indicated some statistics in which they claimed they were capable of detecting grooming. The results were pretty bad, even as initial results, so 12% false positives. So other documents speak of 1% or 0.1%. Here is 12%, which means more or less slightly better than random guessing, but not much. Moreover, we should point out that the initial results only have been developed for English. And in general, as been pointed out by previous speakers, there is quite some content of this nature between young people, which is fully legitimate. And so you would have to distinguish with AI between this legitimate and illegitimate content, would be extremely difficult to do. As a simple example, one would have, for example, to have a reliable way to verify age. And this is something I think which is very hard to do unless we mandate that everybody logs in with a state-provided identity, which brings, of course, many other issues. I don't want to go there, but deriving age based on AI on in a conversation or in a video, this is definitely a very challenging problem. So I want to emphasize the point made by the Jaap Henk that also there is indeed some numbers we all keep citing. They come from a very few reports, from very few sources. And these sources are companies that have financial interest in this technology, and they have never shown the data. It's never been independently checked by scientific evaluations. So I think we have to have serious doubts about this. Of course, as an expert, I can only concur with the previous experts that we should not expect that in the next years or even decades, the magic of AI will solve these extremely difficult problems. So I think we can expect improvement, but the results now are really bad. And I don't think we can expect breakthroughs to get results to level reliability, which makes it acceptable, because which means extremely low false positives. As a final point, I want to come back on client scanning. So if something like this is enforced, as was pointed out, it's very easy to bypass, either by bypassing the AI techniques. Once you know what AI is searching for, it's possible to, of course, bypass it. And you will also be able to use AI to bypass the AI. So we'll get actually a competition between AI tools. And it's not clear at all that detection side, which is the much harder problem, will win here. It's probably the evading side that will win here. Second, you can, of course, also try to bypass this or prevent this, as pointed out by Alexander, by doing the bypass before actually transformation happens, or before a message is being sent, which means that if you want to present this kind of bypassing, you have to enter deeply into the operating system. You have to fully control the operating system and make sure that every picture that appears on a device, is shown on a device, is actually checked, which is even more intrusive than checking on an application basis. And of course, this also will interfere with the right to freely decide which software you run, because if you would run open software and open hardware, it definitely would not be compatible with the proposed regulation. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you very much, Professor Pernille. I think both interventions raise interesting questions about how likely it is that the technologies, once they are deployed, would effectively only target the individuals who they are meant to target. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next speaker, which is Professor Kai Rannenberg, who's the chair of Mobile Business and Multilateral Security at Goethe University in Frankfurt. And so the question to you, Mr. Rannenberg, is whether it is possible to interfere with confidentiality of communications provided by encryption only for a specific type of crime. In other words, is it possible to design such systems in a way to ensure that they are only used in the fight against CSAM? Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much actually to the EDPS to organize this obviously very important seminar, and I have invited CPIS, the Council of European Professional Informatics Society, to this. So actually what I'm going to do is, and I'm going to answer not only out of, let's say, my personal capacity, but also try to report a bit from the reports and statements that CPIS has made in consensus. CPIS is an organization, umbrella organization of 29 informatics professionals organizations, and all over Europe, covering 29 members and 29 European states and most member states. Actually, our president is from Spain at the moment, that may be of interest, and I'm the deputy president. But coming back to your questions first, actually the answer is no. And the answer is no, because good encryption, that I think our experts have already explained, that is made to make exactly this impossible. If you have encryption, or encrypted material, which somehow can be looked at from the outside to see is it for this crime or for that crime or for this, then it's bad encryption. The whole idea of good encryption is do not anybody let's see from the outside what is inside. That's what good encryption is, and we have good encryption, and we know how to do it. And anybody would be stupid to use other encryption, and that would be simply below any kind of industry standard. So the answer is no. And we have been asked these questions actually also on CPIS side sometimes from people from commissioners. So sometimes we feel a bit like being asked for perpetuum mobile in this kind of scenarios. Like to report that. So the other point is it possible to design systems that are only used in the fight against CSAM? Is there function creep possible? And I mean, I understand we have already seen political function creep now with Europol showing interest in certain areas. And I can tell you that from an IT perspective, yes, function creep is possible easily, because actually function creep is the opposite side of business enlargement or functionality enlargement. So a good computer scientist or informatics person is actually educated to make use of something that exists and use it broader, because that is the whole generalization idea of informatics. And so function creep is a concept that security and privacy people like me are describing as a risk and as a danger. And indeed, one needs very good materials or very good functionality or measures to avoid function creep, because function creep is in the very nature of any kinds of informatics product. So again, yes, the risk of function creep is possible. Just one example on maybe some of the CSAM material, we can be pretty sure that these kind of detection softwares, they will probably not work with whatever kind of indicators, examples, templates or so, and those are probably in a properly designed system, according to normal informatics states, will be some kind of file set or cloud set somewhere in an external storage to be either uploaded to the respective operating system or of a smartphone or so to be detected, and they need to be updated. I mean, if you want to find whatever new pornographic material or whatever it is, grooming material, you need to update. And that is done by coming in from an outside source and uploading it in a flexible manner. And the risk of function creep is indeed, I mean, who guarantees that not next time when somebody uses this kind of functionality, you upload whatever kind of maybe an authoritarian politician considers as denigrating material or denigrating something. So the whole idea of function creep is in the very nature of this kind of solutions. And I don't see any way how we could guarantee that it wouldn't happen. You can try to build something in hardware, but that wouldn't fulfill the goals either. So, and it's interesting actually, but now I'd like to go a bit broader maybe from the CPS perspective. And CPS is following these kind of developments for, let's say, 30 years or so, because Ms. Sippel has mentioned it. It came with organized crime, and she said it came with terrorism, which is true. 10 years earlier, it came with organized crime. So we see it with 30 years, and since 30 years, CPS, which is again the informatics societies all over Europe, has said, hey, this doesn't work. We cannot eat our cake and have it at the same time. And it's always new kind of worthy cases coming in, but it doesn't help against the basics of informatics and computer science if you try to do that. So that's the statement that I like to make on how this is actually fundamentally and a major problem. And we had some interaction now again with the Commission also, and we've been asked, please bring us solutions. And we told, sorry, we don't have solutions. And the statements that we made have been done in consensus with all of the member societies and the experts from the member societies. So we're quite sure that all over Europe, we haven't seen anything serious that could be found and could be presented. We will be very interested again, like Mr. Preneel said, these kind of statements or studies that say we are successful. We'd like to see them, and we're sure that we can find a volunteer team to analyze them. But we're not very optimistic that it would be as it's promised. Thanks a lot. That is computer science perspective, informatics perspective from Europe.
Thank you very much, Professor Rannenberg. I'd now like to turn to Sabine Ritting, who is an assistant professor at e-law at the University of Leiden, who I believe is joining us online as well. And I'd like to actually invite her to speak about a topic which we've also touched on a bit on the first panel, is what is going to be the impact of the CSAM proposal on children who are supposed to be the primary beneficiaries.
Thank you so much for this question, and thanks so much for having me at the seminar. Yes, I would like to draw our attention back to a few of the topics that have been raised by other speakers already, which is the negative impact of the CSAM proposal on other children's rights. And of course, it will affect children's right to privacy, personal data protection, freedom of expression, and access to information. And in this context, I really would like to highlight that from a children's rights perspective, privacy and protection are not contradicting each other. Actually, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, in its General Comment number 25, made it very clear that privacy is actually vital for children's safety. So privacy is not a hindrance to children's safety as it's often projected. It's actually an important precondition to safety. So, and I would like to zoom into an aspect that we have heard about already a bit, which is around consensual sexual exploration of adolescents online, and really see how the detection order mechanisms will impact that sexual exploration. So we have heard already that adolescents engage in sexual exploration online, and this can also include the sharing of sexual images or videos or texts. So for example, we have two 16-year-olds who share this kind of content, for example, nudes within a relationship and without sharing these images with another third party. So if you now have a platform that deploys detection technology as a result of the CSAM proposal, what will happen is that this kind of consensually produced and shared imagery will be flagged as potential CSAM. And the reason for that is that the deployed detection technology that we've heard about already quite a bit is indicator-based. So the only thing it can do is detect nudity of children and adolescents, but without any context. So it can only look at the imagery and say, does it fit the indicators or not? But it cannot look at the context in which this image was produced. And of course, from a platform perspective, human review also cannot change that, because even a content moderator who looks at a particular picture or a video cannot differentiate or cannot judge whether this image was produced consensually or not. It's absolutely impossible. So what will happen is that the platform will send these flagged images to the EU Centre. So if we follow the line of the CSAM proposal. So a lot of people have said, well, but then the EU Centre should surely be in a position to be able to filter out consensual and non-consensual content, because we don't really want this kind of consensual content to be then further reviewed by law enforcement and others. But unfortunately, the EU Centre will also not be in a position to filter out this kind of consensual content for two reasons. The first one is obviously the same as for the platform. Even someone at the EU Centre doesn't have the context to really decide whether this image was produced consensually or not. And I mean, considering the complexity of the whole concept of consensual sexual engagement, it's also clear that this is a very complex task, and you need a lot of circumstantial evidence to be able to make a judgment call. But in addition to that, the EU Centre can also legally not exclude this type of content because they apply the legal definitions of the 2011 CSA directive. And in that directive, consensual sexual exploration amongst adolescents is also still considered a criminal offense. So it's only decriminalized if even on EU member state level. So as a consequence, the EU Centre will have to share these kind of images with national law enforcement and or with Europol. And of course, the investigation of these kind of cases doesn't not only require a lot of human resources, because hopefully at the end of that investigation, law enforcement will drop the case, but also carries the risk of prosecution of adolescents for this kind of consensual sexual exploration, because we don't have this kind of decriminalization on all EU member state levels. And this is really where the problem lies. It will be a question of the national legislation in EU member states to see how these cases are being dealt with. However, even if these cases are being dropped by law enforcement, so it doesn't come to the prosecution of adolescents and children, the investigation alone can already be very, very harmful for affected adolescents, especially in cases where we have adolescents from marginalized communities, for example, LGBTIQ children, because this kind of investigation might lead to false disclosure, further marginalization, and in a worst case scenario, also political persecution and the like. So children and adolescents being targets of a criminal investigation is already harmful in and of itself. And unfortunately, the proposal will not be able to prevent that from happening. So this whole process of scanning private communications among adolescents of the most intimate nature, the further review by private sector, by government, the potential involvement of law enforcement, all of that is really a significant violation of children's right to privacy. And I think we have raised this topic, and many others have also today have raised this with the Commission. And unfortunately, there is no response to that particular issue. And I think because there is just no simple answer to that, because it lies in the nature of the subject matter that these kind of cases will not be able to be kind of filtered out along the process. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Witting. So we've heard a lot already about the questions of technical feasibility, accuracy, and effectiveness, and now I'd like to turn to the question of legality. So given the many concerns, it seems very likely that if it were to be adopted in its current form, the CSAM proposal would most likely be challenged. before the CGU. And so the CGU has already addressed the question of general and indiscriminate surveillance measures in its judgments, for example, in the context of the data retention cases. So I would like to ask Professor Frederik Zuiderveen Borgesius for his take on what parallels can be drawn between the CGU case law on data retention and the future of the CSAM proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, so if the question is, are the measures from this proposal a proportionate way of interfering with fundamental rights? The answer must be no, in light of the case law that we know, because the case law that resembles this situation the most is the case law indeed about the data retention requirements in the fight against terrorism. And to refresh our memories, just like now, and I understand the intuition of the Commission. There is now a horrible crime, sexual abuse of children, so I understand their intuition, we should take action. And a similar situation was roughly 15 years ago. We feared terrorism, and the Commission thought we adopt a directive, and that meant basically, it was complicated, but in summary, telecom providers in Europe had to store all metadata of communications because the hope was it would help to fight terrorism. It was adopted. NGOs went to court, made it to the Court of Justice of the European Union, and that court said, terrorism is indeed a horrible crime. Nevertheless, storing metadata, so data about communications of hundreds of millions of innocent Europeans, goes too far. This is not proportional. This requirement is invalid because it's illegal. I think it's not exactly the same, but a similar analysis applies here, because again, we are faced with a horrible crime, and the proposed measure is similar, namely analyzing the communications of hundreds of millions of innocent Europeans. So not proportional. Actually, the court might not even get to a proportionality test because the data retention cases were about metadata. And this is about analyzing the content of communications. And the court has said something about that. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights has an element that says if the essence of a fundamental right is violated, then the measure is illegal by definition. There's no even a need for a proportionality test. And when is the essence violated? Well, the court has said in a different case, if authorities can access the contents of communications on such a large scale, then the discussion is over. No room for a proportionality test. The essence of the right to privacy would be violated, and therefore such a measure would be illegal. I'm aware that there's also differences between this proposal and the data retention cases. Perhaps we can return to that later, because I think now my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Borgesius. I'd now like to turn to Luca Tussoni, who is Specialist Director at the Norwegian SA, and who we had the pleasure of cooperating with also in the context of the joint EDPB-EDPS opinion on the CSAM proposal. And I'd like you to share your reflections, the insights from that opinion regarding the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be able to speak after all these interventions, because my task is a little easier here. I have to kind of summarize and wrap up a bit how we concluded in the joint opinion, because the joint opinion was very much in line with what we've heard so far on this issue. I also wanted to recall that European supervisory authorities were among the first institutional stakeholders to flag the risks of this proposal, and we were quite happy to see the many assessment and formal documents published after our joint opinion were very much in line with what we said there. So we were pleased about that. And what we did in the joint opinion, for those who haven't read it, was to analyze in detail the content of the proposal and essentially test it against the case law that you have just referred to to assess whether the necessity and proportionality standards were met by the proposal. And we reached two main conclusions in that respect. First, that the detection of unknown CSAM and of grooming wouldn't meet those requirements, mainly for the intrusiveness and the error rates we've heard about today. But also other elements have been taken into account to come to that conclusion. One element is the lack of clarity of the requirements that would apply, to issue these detection orders. We found the language to be quite vague and not always easy to follow, hence, would leave room for potential misuses. Also, another obvious element probably is the very large number of data subjects that would be affected by this detection measure. We're talking about essentially all of the user of electronic communications in Europe. Of course, the worryingly low rates, accuracy rates of this technology that other speakers have so well explained today, and essentially the monitoring that would result out of this detection measures that would be indiscriminate, essentially in nature, and not targeted at all. Another point that also was mentioned this morning is the fact that we're not only talking about privacy and data protection here. Other fundamental rights are, of course, at stake and will be most likely affected by the introduction of these detection requirements. And the fact that these kind of measures can be, as we heard, rather easily be circumvented. Another point that we also touch upon is what you also touch upon, Frederick, is the issue of the essence of the fundamental right to privacy and data protection. And there we concluded that at least when it comes to the scanning of audio communication and grooming, we're probably going beyond what would be required to respect that essence. And one could, in my view at least, come to a similar conclusion when assessing measures that would substantially weaken or degrade encryption, because the Court of Justice has said in some cases that data security measures are of essence to preserve the essence of the fundamental right to data protection. So that conclusion could be reached also in that respect. So these were, in a nutshell, the points raised in the joint opinion. Of course, much more can be said, but I'll leave it there and give back the floor to you, Brandon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. And I'd like now to turn to the final speaker of this round, Assistant Professor Teresa Quintel, who is Assistant Professor at the Maastricht EU Center for Privacy and Cybersecurity. Do you share the assessment of the previous speakers? What would be the likely outcome if the regulation were challenged before the Court of Justice? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for organizing this very important event and for inviting me. The full room and the high attendance shows that people actually do care about their fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. And I think that one good thing about this proposal is that it did generate such a great interest, and that there won't be any rushing through of the proposed measures, as was arguably the case for the so-called interim regulation. I agree with the previous speakers regarding the likelihood of the essence of the rights to privacy and data protection being affected by the relevant provisions in the proposed regulation. And I think that it's also likely that the court would find the essence of those rights to be affected as confirmed by the Council Legal Service. Should the court not find an interference with the essence of those rights and decide to enter into a proportionality assessment, it should be very clear about what can and what cannot be done, and it should either confirm or annul certain provisions. The court should not go into legislating, as we have seen previously in the most recent data retention case law or in the PNR judgment. It should not require additional safeguards of procedural nature or attempt to specify certain wording in the proposed regulation, because this would put us in a situation where the court's judgment would be interpreted differently by the different stakeholders, by the different service providers, by the member states who would have to implement the regulation and the judgment. And this would be the most dangerous situation that we could end up in. A regulation, as opposed to a directive, which requires national transposition, should be as specific and as explicit as possible from the start. And it should not be up to the court to complement what the legislator left too unspecific and too vague. There needs to be an evidence-based balancing of the fundamental rights and the interests at stake, and the legislator should be instructed by the court to support any newly proposed measures in the future with reliable numbers on technological possibilities that are independently verified, and by successful takedown measures and prosecutions. Eventually, the court should also clarify further its interpretation from the recent meta judgment on the use of the legitimate interest legal basis under Article 6.1f of the GDPR. The court should make clear whether 6.1f could apply in the context of the CSR and whether voluntary scanning could be possible, even if it is not surrounded with the safeguards that should accompany the detection orders. So that would be the most important points that I would like to make. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Quentel. We're slightly already over time on this round, so I just want to make a quick check if there's anybody in the audience who would like to raise a question or make an intervention before we go to the next panel.
Can I ask a question? Because what we are all talking about the scanning of private communication, but just to go back, the reason why this legislation is proposed is because of the derogation, temporary derogation, which is there because before we had all discussion, there is already scanning in place. Now, for instance, there are tools who are merely there to take down material, not to put it into prosecution whatsoever. I would like to know what your opinion is on those tools, legally seen, because it could be a tool if you have a triple verified database, not just one hash put into by somebody, but really very well verified databases. It could help stop spreading, and that's just it. What's your opinion on that?
I feel like people are actually looking at me to answer the question, which is kind of weird. So we actually had also contemplated this question and had an invitee who could speak specifically to the obligations for hosting providers. If I may, my brief take just before we move on is that the nature of interference between confidentiality of communications and a takedown obligation is fundamentally different in terms of the impact that it would have on citizens and democracy, which is also why I believe Luca will confirm we did not raise many specific issues with regarding to these aspects of the proposal in our joint opinion. But I don't want to preempt anybody else from taking the floor on this. Please go ahead, Frederick.
If somebody sends a picture from holiday to grandparents of the kids on the beach and it is blocked and reported to the EU Center, I would say that that is a worse situation than if the picture is only blocked. So it is perhaps less disproportional, but my argument about massive analysis of, on a massive scale, analysis of communications of hundreds of millions of Europeans largely still stands, but the risk of false positives being reported to the EU Center and to authorities is less. So in that scenario, it is probably less disproportional.
And at the same time, the number of false positives in these kind of blocking scenarios is relatively high. Again, the damage is considered to be considered to be lower. That's why there is some tolerance and some, let's say, maybe some tolerance about that. Actually, some people are unhappy when the stuff gets blocked because maybe it's important for them in a specific situation. And if you look at the things that get blocked and opened up again after investigation, that number is quite high. So we can see that the false positives in these cases are as bad. It's just that the consequences maybe not as bad.
Yeah. I think we also need to understand that the derogation has led to some problems. As voluntary detection, we've seen a number of cases where individuals have had access to services blocked. They've been accused of sharing CSAM when they've just been sharing pictures of their children with a doctor, situations like that. So the detection, as it currently stands on the derogation, is already problematic and should be taken into consideration. And we've also heard reports from law enforcement in Germany and the Netherlands and various other places as well, that they're overwhelmed by the amount of reports they're receiving under the derogation of, as we've already discussed, consensual sharing of material between adolescents. So it's a huge problem already before we even move to the current proposal.
Thank you very much. I have in my notes that Claudia Persman from Bristol University would also like to take the floor. Please go ahead, Claudia.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for inviting me here today. So my name is Claudia Persman. I'm part of the University of Bristol Cybersecurity Group, but I'm also a core researcher at Refrain, which is the UK National Research Centre on Privacy, Harm Reduction and Adversarial Influence Online. I know it's a mouthful, in short, Refrain. What I would like to briefly talk about today here to you is about our work that we've done in the context of the UK Safety Tech Challenge Fund. So within this year's funding round, there were 5 proof of concept tools that were funded to detect or prevent CSAM being shared on end-to-end encryption platforms. Obviously without compromising user privacy. So, and we were asked as Refrain to perform an independent academic evaluation of these 5 proof of concept tools. So proof of concept tools is important here because they were not presented as end user products, obviously. So why is this important? Because I think, to my knowledge, this is the first independent evaluation of industry tools that are designed to detect or prevent CSAM. And obviously, given the specific sensitive nature of deploying this type of technologies within end-to-end encryption environments, we decided that we wanted to take the evaluation approach a step further. So we wanted to develop a framework for evaluating such tools that had a human-centric approach. So the idea was to set up a team with experts on AI, online child protection, and also obviously human rights impact and so on. And we set up a list of criteria, evaluation criteria, to evaluate these tools. We then published these criteria online and asked our stakeholders and the safety tech community and all that to provide us with feedback on these criteria. And we then adjusted the criteria according to the feedback that we were presented with. And we then published the final list. So this list is available. You can download it from our website. And I obviously invite you to have a look at that. We then used this evaluation framework, so the start of such an evaluation framework to evaluate these 5 proof of concept tools. So what we looked at was the human-centeredness of these tools. So what is the impact on human rights of each of these tools? So some of these tools included the hash matching techniques. Some of these had AI-supported tools for detecting unknown child abuse images and videos. We also had a look at specific impacts of the security of these tools. So are there measures in place for detecting any type of adversarial attacks on the technology that was being used? We also obviously had a look at the effectiveness of the tools, so the performance, robustness, scalability. Obviously, just going beyond the typical accuracy measures or looking at false positives and false negatives. We also had a look at if these tools were explainable. So explainability, transparency. So how are the tools transparent in the technology that they are using, but also how is their data flow? So who has access to the data that is being analyzed? And how is the data handled, and so on. We also had a look at disputability and accountability. So if one of these tools makes a decision, and which is a wrong decision, can it be corrected? And who is responsible for this type of decisions within the tool development and industry? And are these tools being built, especially if you're looking at AI-supported tools, are these tools being built on data sets that are fair and non-biased? Because as we have been working in this area of online child protection for over 10 years now, we know that the tools that are currently being built that have access to law enforcement databases, these law enforcement databases that contain actual CSAM material, they have, so they are not fair in terms of victim ethnicity, but also age group and gender groups. So we also had a look at those types of criteria. Just to say, oh, sorry. I'll finalize because I had another series of conclusions, but our findings were in line with what colleagues have already said here, that none of these tools met with our criteria. And it was very hard to have the balance between the rights of all users implied here. So both in terms of legitimate users, young people, but also potential parents sharing pictures of their children with family, but also in terms of potential victims. So each time potential victims' data is being shared, the victim is being re-victimized. So none of these tools were able to meet these criteria. I think this is the most important part of our conclusion, which does not mean that we do not support the development of AI-supported tools for online child protection in general. We just believe that the tools are not ready to be deployed on such a large scale on private messages within end-to-end encryption environments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe we need to rapidly conclude this particular round and pass over to colleagues in the next round. I think we have 20 seconds. 20 seconds only this time, people, for refreshments. So no elaborate coffee breaks, just 20 seconds as we change the scene, gasp, gather our breath, and go into the next panel, which is going to be perhaps the most interesting one on the way forward. Thank you.
Let's resume. My name is Anna Buchta. I'm the head of Policy and Consultation Unit at the EDPS. And in fact, the last presentation was a very nice transition to our third panel, where we will be discussing the way forward. But before I go there, I would like to briefly mention, since this was discussed by previous panel, the EDPS is organizing a seminar on the concept of the essence of the fundamental right to data protection and privacy on the 8th of November. So far, it's an invitation-only event. We will have speakers from the Court of Justice, from the European Court of Human Rights, academics, and legal experts from EU institutions and bodies. But if any of you would be interested in attending this event on the 8th of November, please let us know immediately after or reach out to us later, but don't wait too long, obviously, since this is coming up quite quickly. So the objective of this last round is to try to chart a possible way forward. There have been some new ideas discussed in the context of the negotiations. And of course, we all know that child abuse and its perpetuation on the internet are real problem and demand a strong and effective response. However, given the many doubts expressed regarding the proposal here today and also before, clearly another different path is needed. Therefore, this round will explore alternatives that could genuinely address such a complex societal problem, also looking at the approaches chosen in other countries. And I should add a disclaimer: discussing any given option, technical or legal here, does not mean its endorsement in terms of legality or compliance with the Charter. So we are really in an open brainstorming exercise here. So with that, I would like to first turn to Monica Horten, who is a current independent policy advisor, but has many years of experience in digital rights in the online context in particular. So Monica, how much is the legal framework for fighting CSAM in the United Kingdom different from what we are contemplating here in the EU? And also, what is your take on the recently enacted Online Safety Act?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. The short answer to that question is that the technical implementations that are being discussed in the UK, with all their flaws and problems, are comparable to what's being discussed in the EU, but the legal framework is entirely different, with weaker protection for privacy and fundamental rights. Measures to address child sexual abuse material online and particularly I'm going to focus on their application on encrypted services and chat platforms, will be implemented under powers granted to the telecoms and media regulator, Ofcom. Legal opinion suggests that these measures entail suspicionless, unwarranted, blanket, disproportionate surveillance. Ofcom's powers are stronger than those available to the intelligence services. However, it's very easy to miss all of this. The Online Safety Bill is a skeleton bill. It provides the bare bones with very little detail. And the only way that you might understand that these measures to address private messaging services are in this bill is from two words. It says communications publicly or privately. And it is those words, or privately, in the bill that are intended to mean private messaging platforms. So the powers in the bill would allow Ofcom to impose a requirement on private chat platforms, asking them to use AI-based content moderation systems to detect and identify proactively child sexual abuse material. When it is identified, it must be reported to the National Crime Agency. The requirement is given to service providers in the form of a technology notice. Providers will be asked to implement accredited technologies, and this phrase requires some unpacking. The accreditation will be done by Ofcom according to standards set by the Home Office. If providers don't want to use the government-approved software, they may use their best endeavours to develop their own system, but it must still meet the Home Office approved standards. The bill doesn't explicitly state whether client-side scanning is the intended technology, although it looks very much like that's what they mean. What's noticeably missing is a consideration of Article 8 privacy rights. Ofcom is required to consider, when it's making the technology notices, the prevalence of illegal content and the risk, or the level of risk, rather, of the breach of privacy. Ofcom must consult the Information Commissioner, and it must also consult acquire a consultant to review the technology notice. It must also review the accredited technology, but there is no requirement for a human rights assessment and no judicial review. Indeed, there was an amendment, a last-minute amendment, to insert a judicial review that was withdrawn. In light of the disproportionate surveillance, this is clearly inappropriate. And I'd like to conclude with a short comment about my understanding of the UK government's position, because I've been asked about it by a couple of people here. These measures are in the law. This law is about to go on the statute, which is the UK process for turning a bill into adopted law. Home Office ministers take a hard line on these issues. Ofcom is under political pressure to implement these measures. There is, as many of you may be aware, a general election around the corner, and there is a wide assumption that there will be a change of government. But I will have to comment here that the Labour Party and the opposition have also been in agreement with this bill as it has been passed. So the only thing I can say here is we have to wait and see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So now I'm turning to Iverna McGowan, the Director of Europe's Office of the Center for Democracy and Technology. And I think you would like to comment about the conditions, what would be needed for the detection orders to be compliant with fundamental rights? And also, are there any other laws on the books, such as DSA, for example, that could contribute also to the fight against CSAM?
In 3 minutes. Thank you very much to the colleagues at EDPS for organising this extremely important seminar. I think I'd like to begin on the point of coherence of current EU legislation. And it struck me in the second panel that we talked today that the word AI was mentioned a lot. And now everybody will know that, of course, there's heated debate going on at the moment at the European Union's AI Act that's being discussed. And there's still imperfections there, but the logic of that piece of legislation is a risk-based approach in the technology. And although there's some disagreement still between the different institutions, the broad consensus is high risk means law enforcement involvement, vulnerable groups plus AI. And if you look at the CSA proposal, we have some of the most vulnerable children, high use of AI, and pretty much law enforcement is essential. So it's striking when we think about the coherence of EU law and policy, how we could have such a differing approach. And I think we need to really question that when it's children's rights are at stake, as some of the other colleagues have said. So definitely, I do think that there was a lot of discussion, very careful and considered discussion as the EU Digital Services Act was being discussed on getting that really important balance right of saying what are the checks and balances, procedural safeguards, technological safeguards, and others that we need to do when it comes to the removal of unlawful content online, as opposed to what we do with content that, as can be said, is awful but lawful. And a lot of thought and consideration went into that. There are provisions in particular to do with child rights. And we still haven't seen, obviously the DSA hasn't had a chance, the rubber hasn't hit the road yet. We still don't know how effective a tool that will be in addition to the toolkit that we have already of obviously reporting and removing information online. So it's really, when we consider just the last three panels today, what's at stake and the risks, I do think it's very important to bear in mind. The last point, as you said, this question about what, with the current draft that's on the table, what would be needed? And I'm a human rights lawyer by training. So I think we talked a lot today about technological feasibility or infeasibility, as the case may be. And we've also talked about various points of privacy law. What I think is really concerning, and indeed the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights has talked this as well, is the fundamental risk that the proposal is pointing at to human rights in the context of criminal law. So you mentioned, for example, the detection orders. What essentially the detection orders amount to are warrantless searches of our digital world. And it seems to be almost most effective when you put this in the real world context to say, we would of course never expect or accept that law enforcement would enter our homes, our private setting, with no warrant and no reasonable suspicion to search everything belonging to us. And so we cannot, of course, allow that to happen on the online space either, because it would be a death nail to the rule of law and criminal law as we know it in the digital context. And as has been very eloquently iterated by numerous speakers already, This is important because it is the most vulnerable children, whether they be children of irregular migrant background, whether it be children from different minorities, including LGBTQ. So these are not, these are really fundamental questions about maintaining the rule of law in our online digital world. And so the question of how we would make this in terms of ways forward, we would have to fundamentally rewrite those provisions in order to make them compliant. It would have to be formulated with sufficient precision to ensure that people whose conduct in no way involves suspicion of criminal activity would not fall down the scope. An independent judicial authority would issue an official document describing the specific purposes of such a search and the basis upon which individuals or groups or individuals are considered suspect. And a proportionality test would need to be inbuilt about whether the law allows for an independent assessment. So, for example, if there's an overriding public interest, and I'm not making that up, that's actually based on the case law of both the European Court of Human Rights and the ECJ and others. So if you consider that all of these different elements would have to be in line in order for a detection order to be lawful, then I think we're in a very challenging situation at the moment with the text that's on the table before us. And in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but very happy to discuss further later. Thank you.
Thank you. So after this introduction of more legal and policy nature, let me turn to our next speaker who will be joining us online from overseas, Professor Matthew Green. I hope he's with us.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Good.
Thank you very much for joining us. So the topic for the next few speakers, we will be discussing more technology related questions. And we have already heard some comments about client-side scanning that has been propped up as a solution to avoid breaking quote unquote encryption. Is it a suitable alternative in your view?
So to begin with, this is a very complicated technical area. And what I mean by complicated is that as computer science researchers, we've just begun to look at this technology. I want to stress how completely new the idea of client-side scanning is, that the very first computer science research papers on the topic appeared in 2021, and we're not even 2 years later, and we're already discussing laws that mandate it. So this is really, sometimes it's exciting to be on the cutting edge of technology. I'm not as excited in this particular case. The basic idea of encryption and end-to-end encryption specifically is that we take data that is usually concentrated in plain text and is available on servers, which are relatively easy for people to compromise and to hack into and collect huge amounts of data. And then we encrypt that data so it's no longer present in a readable form at that location. And that doesn't necessarily mean the data goes away. It means that the data is not concentrated. It's now distributed. The actual data itself is distributed with the end-to-end devices, meaning the phones and the laptops where people are generating it. And this makes hacking much more difficult. It also makes mass surveillance by design much more difficult. Of course, as an engineer, if you think about how you wanted to implement some kind of mass scanning plan, the data still exists. It just exists at the edge of the network. It's no longer concentrated in the center. So client-side scanning takes advantage of that fact and says, let's move those scanning systems, if we must have them, let's move them out to the individual people's devices. And it sounds like a very good, straightforward technical plan until you think about the implications. And perhaps the biggest implication is those scanning algorithms are extremely sensitive for a variety of reasons. One of them is that they contain oftentimes information that is the direct product of, in the case of CSAM, is the direct product of child abuse. They contain hashes or summarizations of abuse imagery. And in order to scan for that, you have to put some function of that information into the scanning algorithms. And sometimes it can be extracted, which is extremely terrifying. If you imagine that somebody can pull actual raw images out of these models, it's not completely impossible. The other reason is, of course, if somebody knows the algorithms, they can do some extremely unpleasant things. The simplest one, the least worrisome, is just evade the algorithms. Evading becomes trivial when you can see the algorithms. The second problem is that people can generate imagery that now deliberately, the imagery that looks innocuous or media that looks innocuous, but is somehow designed to actually trigger those algorithms to go off. So political imagery that is completely legal can now appear as child sexual abuse media because it's very easy to generate those types of what we call collisions. Anyway, I won't give too long an answer on this. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the problem of building systems where those algorithms are confidential and can't be exploited is something we're just beginning to research. And so far, many of our technical results are negative in the sense that we keep finding ways to break these systems. And break them means that we will ultimately violate the confidentiality of many users. We will cause false positives, will cause bad data to be injected into the system. And in some cases, there's this, possibility that abuse victims may be re-traumatized if the systems are built poorly. So my overall, again, I'm just a computer scientist. I'm not a legislator or a lawyer. My request to this community is please give us time to actually do the research to figure out whether and how to do this safely before we start to deploy these systems and mandate them by law.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to David Frauci, Senior Director at the Internet Society, with the question whether there is a way to draft the CSAM proposal so that it is compatible with end-to-end encryption, but still provides an effective response to the problem. David?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Among the mission of the Internet Society, we advocate for a trustworthy and secure Internet. This bill, as it is written right now, is against this mission. Whether it's weakening encryption by a man-in-the-middle solution or client-side scanning, we think that this is completely wrong. So for those in the room who don't understand, because this is too technical perhaps, a man-in-the-middle solution to weaken encryption means that Signal or WhatsApp would be obliged to open the message and read the content. Of course, this should not be a solution. Client-side scanning, on the contrary, means that software should be installed on mobile devices, and everything will be scanned before being sent. Encryption would not be broken. There would not be a man in the middle, but your device would be scanning and spying on what you are doing. This means that one solution is like opening the letter. Somebody in the mailbox or the mail system opens the letter and reads it. Client-side scanning is having someone reading upon your shoulder while you write the letter. So none of them are compatible with privacy. So child abuse is a societal problem, and there's no technological wand like go like this and makes a solution for this. We need societal solutions for a societal problem. We, as before, what we need to reinforce educative systems. We need to have well-trained law enforcement agencies, and we need to effectively empower children. It has been mentioned in the room before that children have not been part of this debate, and this is completely wrong. Also, on way forward, we have also the option of reporting tools. Many platforms do not have any kind of real way to report when somebody, a user, detects CSAM. This should be implemented. Those few that have a reporting tool, they don't have an effective follow-up from law enforcement. And from those who have a follow-up from law enforcement, there's no, many times there's no loop being closed. So the user is never informed of what happened with his action. So this disincentivizes totally the use of reporting tools. So it's important not to lose sight of the importance of the value of the internet. So for every child that is being abused and its content is being shared, there are also many cases of children who have a problem and they find a community that helps them with people that have similar problems. And encryption is also part of this solution. Any changes about how the internet operates should be taken with a lot of caution. So way forward, I think it is important that we have events like this one. The joint report by the European Data Protection Supervisor was a great document. It shows very much where are the problems. And in our view, the way forward is clearly ensuring that policymakers in this House and the Council, they make the necessary amendments to ensure that this bill is compatible with the rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So another idea that has already been mentioned in previous panels is basing detection on metadata. And so let me now turn to Helen Charles, Public Policy Director for WhatsApp, with the question, could detection measures based on processing only of metadata provide a viable alternative to communications content scanning, taking into account the effectiveness, lawfulness, and proportionality?
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers for having me here today at this important debate. I want to just start by strongly agreeing with colleagues here who have voiced concerns about the proposals. As I said in my earlier interventions, at WhatsApp and Meta, we agree with the aims of the regulation, but we have serious concerns with the proposals as currently being debated, particularly around the impact on encryption and the fact that some of the approaches that have been proposed around scanning would undermine the benefits of encryption for vulnerable users, as Ella articulated earlier, but also for children and EU citizens as a whole. We therefore think it's really important that the regulation explicitly protects encryption, but also ensures that providers like WhatsApp are able to tackle CSAM without accessing message content. And this means enabling providers to deploy other techniques. These other techniques might be things like thinking about product design and how product design can be deployed to prevent harm, but also including approaches like user reporting and indeed other techniques that involve use of data, in particular traffic data. Now, earlier today, we heard from others in the room about the different nature of harm. And as providers, it's really important that we have a range of approaches available to us to be able to act on particular harm archetypes. So we're not looking at CSAM as a harm as a whole, but we're being really targeted to the harm that we are looking to address. So earlier we heard about the difference between consensual image sharing with teens. That is very different from offender to offender contact, or indeed offenders who are using services to try and seek out contact with minors. All of those require different response to services, and having access to some data can be helpful in a targeted, proportionate way to address those risks. Where it is legal, Meta does deploy techniques, including the use of traffic data, to identify potentially problematic behavior. This is not just about detection, though. This is also about prevention, and this speaks to the point I made earlier. Traffic data can be an important signal when used with other signals to help services proactively disrupt violating message groups and accounts who may be seeking to abuse our services. Back to the regulation and the law, we know that the e-privacy directive and the derogation does refer to traffic data, but it's specifically limited to detection, reporting, and takedown. There's nothing in there about prevention. So we would encourage institutions, when they're thinking about the way forward here, to both ensure end-to-end encryption is protected and that services can tackle CSAM without accessing message content, but also look at ways that EPG traffic data could be processed in a proportionate and targeted manner, including for prevention. And we think in this way, the regulation will move closer to achieving its objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Andrea Bellu from EDRI. We have already heard in how many ways the proposal does not address the full spectrum of measures that would need to be taken to effectively combat child sexual abuse. So is it possible to achieve any results with non-tech measures?
Thank you, Anna. And I would like to start by reminding what you mentioned at the beginning of this session, that we're dealing with a very complex societal issue. And this mandates a holistic approach to solution finding. And of course, non-technical solutions are part of that holistic approach. Unfortunately, many of them are missing from the current draft proposed on the CSA regulation. And in the interest of time, I will only mention a few. Also, with the note that these recommendations come from children's rights organizations, from abuse survivors organizations, from social workers, really from those who are in the first line fighting against this horrific crime. First, we have investment in social services, because especially when we're looking at child protection departments, schools, anti-poverty measures, and other survivor victim support services, investment in these could really ensure that the children especially are protected when they're already at risk of abuse. Secondly, increasing both EU and national funding for hotlines. Hotlines that are a very important element in tackling this crime, ensuring also they have a proper legal basis to function, and committing funds in advance to make sure that hotlines are not in a precarious situation all the time and that their capacity is boosted. We already know that they remove vast amounts of CSAM hotlines from the internet quickly and also provide support to survivors. Another solution I would like to draw attention to is the enforcement and harmonizing of existing rules. It was already mentioned that we have the 2011 Child Sexual Abuse Directive that contains many provisions for member states to tackle child sexual abuse. And unfortunately, after 11 years, we're still not looking at the fully implemented directive. The DSA was also mentioned that further offers a lot of support and opportunities to tackle illegal content online, including CSAM, and GDPR that was also mentioned. In some cases, it requires also providers to take steps to keep children safe. Finally, I'd like to point to a set of demands that have long been requested for by children protection organization, education, awareness raising, and empowerment of survivors. Really increasing awareness in and access by young people to hotlines, to institutional reporting, such as police or social services, but also supporting the mechanisms for reporting are really crucial in tackling this horrific crime. And my main point is that there are many non-technical measures. I mentioned investment in hotlines, I mentioned investment in social services, existing regulation, education, awareness raising, and empowerment. And unfortunately, over-focusing this draft on techno-solutionist measures to a material-focused characterization of the problem is taking away the focus from those who are fighting for really holistic approaches. So it's really a disservice in the grand scheme of things. Thank you.
Thank you. And in a similar vein, let me turn to Evelyn Austin from Bits of Freedom with the question whether these alternative non-technical measures to combat child sexual abuse are given sufficient attention in the current deliberative process.
So Andrea really said it already. The simple answer is no. So like the Commission, Bits of Freedom is also not a child protection expert. But unlike the Commission, we do know how to listen to them. And when this proposal was introduced, the first thing we did was the simple task of reviewing recommendations issued by leading Dutch experts over the past couple of years. And without even having to get out of bed, we found 4 big commonalities across the board. So the first one was that, foremost, the recommendations focus on prevention. So for example, the Dutch Rapporteur on Trafficking in Human Beings and Sexual Violence Against Children, the government's principal advisor on this topic, argues heavily for sexual education, including an emphasis on the positive aspects of sexuality. The second is maybe turning your previous question around, which non-technical measures are needed. It struck us that across the board, there were hardly any technical measures being recommended. For instance, one recommendation by the Dutch Sexual Assault Center is to improve care for victims and coordination within the care system. And although the Sexual Assault Center doesn't discuss specifically why tech won't solve that problem, we also haven't spotted any tech solutions in the Commission's proposal that will. The third commonality is the importance of evidence-based measures. So the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement and the Dutch rapporteur too both point to the fact that of the 40+ teaching methods that are currently in use, only one has proven to be effective. And it's easy to see which improvements could be made there. Then finally, experts stress that any interventions have to come with little or no negative side effects to be useful. So take, for instance, the awareness campaigns that Andrea just rightfully mentioned. There have been numerous of these campaigns on sexting over the past couple of years. And the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime, again, points to research showing that many of these campaigns focus on dissuading young people from sexting altogether. And in doing so, actually shames victims and prevents young people from reaching out for help. So to conclude, what experts say is that what we need are evidence-based, non-technical, preventive measures without negative side effects. And it seems to us that the European Commission's proposal takes the exact opposite approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So finally, last but not least, let me turn to Patrick Breyer, who is one of the shadow rapporteurs for the current proposal, with probably the biggest question of the day. Is there a viable way forward for this proposal, given what we've heard here today?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Wojciech, for organizing this event, and also thank you to all experts that have come here together, because I know how much work you have dedicated to this cause and this proposal, and together we have achieved an amazing result. Without your work, we wouldn't be where we are now, seeing that level of attention and pressure to respect our rights in regard to this proposal. So thank you, everyone, also the experts online, for joining. Now, it's clear that the Commission's chat control proposal is unprecedented in the free world, and it divides child protection organizations, abuse victims, other stakeholders, even political groups, into those that want to implement as much as possible of it, hoping it would make us the world leader on child protection, and others who would prefer to reject it altogether and saying this would make us the world leader on mass surveillance and harm children and eliminate anonymity. But I think that if policymakers decide to go for a consensual approach, try to bring the two sides together and keeping only the parts of the proposal that everyone agrees on, but then consensually adding new effective approaches, I think we can protect children much better. We can avoid annulment in court. We can achieve consensus in society and also a broad majority in Parliament and in Council. However, to do that, it's certainly not sufficient to limit the chat control scanning to known material, as Council Presidency recently proposed. Even when it comes to known material, we have up to 80% of reports which our authorities say are not criminally relevant, because the views on what constitutes criminally relevance and what doesn't differ. One element of crime is intention. And if you post something in a group of 1,000 people, then maybe 999 lack the intention. It's simply not relevant. Also, this instrument, even if limited to known CSAM, would still create a precedent of chilling mass surveillance of private communications that would be expanded one by one. I'm furthermore convinced that it's not sufficient to simply remove detection orders from this for now, as my own government proposes, because the problems go beyond detection orders with this proposal. So what I think is that a new approach is needed that focuses on preventing child sexual abuse. So that includes strictly limiting the scanning of communications to persons presumably involved in child sexual exploitation. So basically, you remove chat control and you replace it by targeted investigations. That's the only way to avoid annulment in court and achieving nothing at all for our children. We are working hard on this in Parliament, but as you know, Council is refusing any measure of targeting so far. We also need to avoid untargeted voluntary detection by industry, both concerning content and metadata, because it suffers the same problems of proportionality as the mandated detection. And also even the Commission advises against it. And the same goes for not turning our personal devices into scanners in order to backdoor encryption. So we need to explicitly exclude client-side scanning. What the Council is looking at some vague commitments to how important encryption is does not do the job. An acceptable alternative to mass surveillance when it comes to detection, in my opinion, and especially if the aim is to clean the web, would be proactive crawling of publicly accessible material, which is something that's already being done in the UK and in Canada. This is something that could be placed in the hands of the new EU center and doesn't create the same problems as chat control. And beyond scanning, we need to remove age verification requirements for messaging services as proposed to protect the right to communicate anonymously, which is so important to so many people, and whistleblowers would not certainly reveal secrets and endanger themselves if they have to present their face or their ID in order to operate a messaging account. And also we need to avoid app censorship for the young generation. You know, what they're proposing to block apps for teenagers under 16 only because others could contact them. It's like a digital house arrest, like not letting your children out in the streets because they could be spoken to by some other persons. And I think all that should be replaced by mandating specific measures to make services safe by design. For instance, shouldn't profiles be restricted to be private unless the user explicitly wants to make them publicly visible? Should anybody be able to reach out to new users and to send them all sorts of photos without the user even being asked? And shouldn't the users have the right to decide whether they want to see nude photos? It's possible to tell on the device without giving any information to the provider. And so such confirmation could also go a long way to warning teenagers and children of what it could be the consequences, and maybe offering them to reach out for support. And maybe just the last thing that I want to mention, the new EU Center should focus on prevention, on victim support, on research, on best practices for law enforcement. The non-technical solutions are simply key to preventing child sexual abuse, and we can't focus just on technical approaches only. So if the negotiations on chat control go wrong, the regulation could mean the end of truly confidential private messaging and secure encryption. It could pave the way to introducing unprecedented authoritarian methods to democracies. You know, if they start scanning our communications without cause, what prevents them from scanning our devices or even from scanning our homes? There is technology of shot detection. Everything can be done with AI. And I think if that precedent is set, that it is justified to intrude in personal and private spaces just because there could be some hint of a crime, then this very much destroys the essence of the right to privacy. But if we prevail with our views, I think we can set a global example for protecting children online in line with our values. And that's what I'm fighting for, not just for our generation, but also for our children, because I want them to grow up in a free world where we trust each other and not in a surveillance state of mutual fear. And I think we have the opportunity to achieve this. And again, thank you for all your contributions to this end.
Thank you very much for these very rich comments. I know that there would be many questions to you specifically and to others from the room, but I'm not going to open the floor to questions because we are already past the time, and instead hand the floor back to the supervisor.
Thank you, Anna. Well, that's true that we are already 25 minutes over the original schedule. That's also true that this is not the end of the discussion for today, because those of you who still have a time and strength for the discussion, I would like to invite to the unofficial part of this meeting, which will be organized in the pub London Calling at Place Londres at 5 o'clock. It's not far away from here, walking distance from the European Parliament. Let me say a few words at the end, still also leaving the place, the room for the further discussions in the lobby. Well, I think we learned a lot today, and I believe that there is a lot of food for thought and for current legislative work, although they are so advanced and no big changes are expected in the text which is at the moment prepared in the Parliament. At the same time, I have to say that the threats that were shown today and the uncertainty that we presented still do not paint the full picture. We still did not talk about the scope of the intrusion into the privacy that we will see. We have to remember that we are not talking only about the Facebook, Instagrams, WhatsApps, and etc., but we are talking also about the universes which are made in the games, the things like the universes like Roblox, like Genshin Impact, like Call of Duty or Fortnite, only noting that use the chat as the main contact between the players are to be discussed as well. And in the current form, including as regards to what is currently on the table, the CSAM proposal would fundamentally change the internet and the digital communication as we know it now. Coming from the country which used to have the regime period in the past, I remember very well that as children, we have to be prepared, that we are observed and we are under any kinds of surveillance. And I also remember how important for us was to find a place where we are not observed, where we are not under the control. And when I first sent my own children to the kindergarten, and the kindergarten proposed that the CCTV will enable me to observe the child throughout the day, I was, of course, very happy as a father. But at the same time, I started to think whom I will get as the adult person if my daughter will be taught from the very early childhood that she is all the time observed and all the time surveilled. And what does she do when she will realize that at some moment she's not observed and she's not under surveillance? What stupid thing will come to her mind at the moment when suddenly she is away? So a lot of things to think about, a lot of tools that we are going to be provided with remind me the story of Eternal Blue, the exploit that was created in order to be used by the law enforcement authorities. I would like to thank all the participants, all the audience, all the people who took part in the panels, and also to Kazik from my cabinet, Anna Buchta, the head of the policy and consultation team in EDPS, and Brendan van Alsenoy, who is the deputy head of the same unit. I also would like to thank the other people who worked on it in the EDPS office. We have here Niksha, Matthias, Plamen, who gave also the point of view of the law enforcement authorities and the judges. So, yeah, and of course, I have to say about the work of our information and communication team, who prepared the whole event and gave it also the possibility, gave the people the possibility to see it from outside. Thank you very much, and well, see you in London Calling, and see you in the other discussions on this topic, and also once again reminding the conference that we organized on 8th of November on the essence of the right to privacy, and Anna and Brendan serve with the information about the event. Thank you very much.